Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz is the senior rabbi at Kehilath Jeshurun on the Upper East Side. That's KJ to most of us in New York City. He's a much sought after speaker and teacher, and he is one of my personal teachers. I have relied on him more times than I can count. After nearly 3 decades of experience in the rabbinate, Chaim has mastered the art of presenting the timeless wisdom of ancient texts in a contemporary way that makes it matter. He is also a writer and has written a regular column for the Canadian Jewish News. His articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Daily News, the Toronto Star, the Gazette and La Presse, as well as the Jerusalem Post, the Forward, and many other Jewish newspapers, including the Jewish Journal. He wrote a beautiful piece we're going to be talking about today. He also has an online blog of articles entitled The Happiness Warrior. This is not a happy time for the happiness warrior.
No, it's not. It's a time in which we actually have to sort of battle. We have to battle for meaning. We have to battle for our own lives. And of course, we have to battle for something that will bring us happiness in the future.
So battling for our own lives, I think we get that. Battling for meaning, I respond enormously to that in my own way, but I want to push you to translate it.
I think that what ends up happening is that there's often instinctual responses. Some of them are fear, some of them are anger and fury and a desire just to lash out. And I think that what we have to do is first of all come together, come in support, and do what is right. Because at the end of the day, it's all going to be about our Jewish identity. Are we doing this as Jews, or are we just doing this because we're reacting blindly?
And when you say doing this, I assume you mean the response, the military response, the potential devastating effect on Palestinians who are not necessarily combatants or even approving of what their government has done or their leadership has done. And yet we all want justice here. We all want to right this ship. And we are chilled by the barbarism. I'll speak for myself. I know I'm speaking for many others. And compassion is not impossible, but it is harder in this moment, I think. It is not that we're losing our humanity, but so many have lost their humanity for us.
So let me start first with where I would start here in America. I mean, I think that we have to support. We have to be charitable, generous, and supporting of our brothers and sisters in Israel. We have to come together in a unified fashion. Just a week before this war broke out, Israel was really at an impasse. It almost was at the edge of a civil war. And what we've recognized is that if we don't come together as a family, we will fail. So you have the idea of being there to support with kindness, coming together as a community, and you're absolutely right, to do so with a Jewish set of values. The thing that is remarkable to me, even at this very moment, in which critics of Israel are spending their time saying, look at what Israel's doing, is that Israel is taking this very carefully. They've asked people to evacuate from their homes. Repeatedly. And what Israel is doing is following values that have been part of Israel since the establishment of the state. And the point is that we have to fight this war, but we're going to fight this war as Jews with Jewish values.
And what are Jewish values?
Jewish values are a recognition that all human beings are created in the image of God. Jewish values are the recognition that we, as a community, have a special responsibility to each other. Jewish values are that we need to be generous, particularly when we see our brothers and sisters in great peril.
B'Tselem Elohim, each is made in the image of God. Does that apply to one's mortal enemy?
Everybody's made in the image of God. What has to be done, however, is to protect those who are good from those who are evil. And that's actually two very difficult thoughts to hold in your mind at the very same time. But there needs to be a recognition that we are fighting a war. The people on the other side are human beings. And by the way, I think that all of Israel understands this. That this is, I would say, I mean, obviously there are also people at the fringes, but I would say that if you stop the ordinary Israeli in the street, they would say, we are doing what we have to do to save ourselves. In fact, many of them may point out that not only has Hamas perpetrated horrible massacres, this is, of course, the largest, but they've been firing rockets at civilians for years. Hamas has been oppressing their own people in Gaza. And the recognition that the evil of Hamas is something that affects people on both sides of the border is widespread in Israel. People understand. And so, I would just tell you that is really how this war is being put forward, that there's a recognition that we are going to fight this. We're not going to fight this their way. We're not going to go out and target civilians. We're going to fight this our way, in which we're going to take away military targets.
In terms of the state of shock that many of us are still in, obviously there's been a lot of information that kind of has been revealed over days that make it worse than we even knew when we were in the moment. How do you speak to your congregants, for instance, who just are still reeling? Are there words for that?
This is a tragedy. When you have tragedies, everybody says there are no words. This is the phrase that's being repeated over and over again in Israel. When people have the conversation with each other, they just say, Ein milim, there are no words. To sort of adjust your own mind, your own soul, to this enormous catastrophe is almost impossible. I think that the shock of this happening and the recognition that perhaps we put too much faith in the intelligence services or the army or whatever else is part of that shock. It's almost like we had faith. We assumed this would be all okay. We have a beautiful fence that should have kept these terrorists out. And then all of a sudden, that's not what happened. And so that's part of it. And part of it is now the grieving, because the Jewish world is grieving. And I've had conversations with people where people say, first they'll say to me, how are you doing today? And then I've had 3 people say this to me in like the last 2-3 days. You know what, I retract that question, because that's not an appropriate question now. We're all grieving. We're all mourning. This is the world Jewish family coming together in grief. And the problem with this type of grief is that it's almost like a prison. Seth Mandel, who unfortunately lost his son Kobe in a terrible terror attack in 2001. He actually set up a whole system of camps for children who have been affected by terror attacks. And I remember Seth telling me that this type of grief is like a prison, because either you wake up in the morning thinking about your loss, or you wake up in the morning not thinking about your loss and then feeling guilty, why wasn't I thinking about my loss? And we're almost in that sort of phase where if anyone, and certainly in Israel, if anyone for a moment tries to breathe and step out of the grief, you feel guilty. In America, we're not quite as affected as the people in Israel, right, but you feel profoundly guilty. How can I step out of this grief?
When you also see what's, I don't have to tell you, on social media and American campuses right now, it compounds the sense of grief, because there's a sense of isolation and something being revealed that is ugly, at least to my mind.
Yeah.
How are you responding to that trend? I'm sure you're not Mr. Instagram.
I'm not Mr. Instagram. I am on Instagram. I do have an Instagram account, and I've been posting a bit more recently.
Because my feed is giving me every example of this. And I feel like I need to bear witness to it, and yet it's very hard to see. Well,
it's fascinating that the places that offer the greatest support to Hamas outside of Iran are university campuses in America. And it speaks to perhaps a culture on these campuses. I know that students feel profoundly beleaguered. I heard a student on Shabbat talking about Hunter College, where she was in a class about geography, and a Jewish student, had nothing to do with the Middle East. And the professor came in the day after the war started and said, let's talk about the Middle East conflict, and started to talk about how terrible Israel is. This is right after this massacre. And a couple of students started to support the professor. And now this young lady, who had an enormous amount of courage, because when you challenge your professor, your grade is also put into doubt, she got up and said, I need to tell you what really happened. And I don't know how you can speak about this way, when I know people who were personally affected by this war. And this is happening over and over on college campuses. Sometimes it's even driven by our own Jewish students. Sometimes it's driven by young Jews who somehow have bought a narrative. And to me, what's remarkable is that we have black is white and white is black. I saw one influential young Jew who was a rabbi who wrote that this is all about the occupation. Now, this type of ideology of Islamic anti-Semitism, in which people distort the teachings of Islam to believe in anti-Semitism, is well over a century old. In 1929, there was a massacre in Palestine, in what was then part of the British Mandate, of 133 Jews. And people came in and yelled, "Death to the Jew." In Hebron, in the city of Hebron, there was a yeshiva there. People came into the yeshiva and murdered dozens of the students in the yeshiva. They were just sitting and studying Torah. And this preceded the state, certainly preceded the occupation. It was actually precipitated by the fact that some of the Jewish worshipers at the Kotel, at the Western Wall, which was tiny then, brought a bench to sit on. And that's how these riots began, because that wasn't part of the status quo, and it was an invasion. And so here you have people saying black is white and white is black. And
you're not talking about a racial lens. You're talking about the metaphor.
I mean, metaphorically, that up is down and down is up.
Right.
That we're just turning things upside down.
And I also want to make sure that you're clarifying that I know you don't see all of Islam as believing in these things at all, and those who subscribe to an observant Muslim life are not subscribing to these things as a rule.
Well, let's look at the Middle East. Let's look how many countries have made peace with Israel. And I think that itself speaks powerfully about where this is coming from. This is not coming from Islam. This is coming from a radical group which is being pushed forward by Iran, and Iran has all of its proxies around the state of Israel, and Iran has its own particular motivations for what they're doing. And if you look at the Arab world is ready to make peace with Israel. And
was
Hamas,
that not even part of what instigated possibly this attack, is that they've said, we're getting isolated.
Yes.
They're not caring about us. We're going to make them care.
Absolutely, and that may be part of it. And the tragedy is that when Ariel Sharon decided in 2005, let's disengage. Let's give them an opportunity for self-government. So immediately they started to smuggle weapons. So Israel has to then close the borders. Now that becomes the propaganda point. Look, they've turned this into an open-air prison.
Right.
And it's because Hamas has taken the money that was meant to aid ordinary Gazans and has invested it in weapons systems to point them at the state of Israel. And they're far more committed to destroying Israel than they are to supporting their own people.
So you just talked about the narrative that some have bought into, even American Jews, and that is going to be, I think, further hardened by what's about to happen in terms of what we're going to see in Gaza. How would you suggest we navigate the difficulty that we're about to experience in watching civilian lives end?
Look, going back to Jewish values, I think we need to cry every time an innocent human being dies. We do it at the Seder. We pour the wine out because we're crying over Pharaoh's death. We don't want there to be death. At the same time, as there's an old American phrase that the Constitution is not a suicide pact, Israel has to defend herself. And the only way she reasonably can defend herself right now is to absolutely destroy Hamas. It's going to be a difficult war. As Michael Walzer in his book, Just and Unjust Wars, points out, there is no way for a war to proceed without there being civilian deaths unless it's fought at sea or in a desert. Anytime you're fighting a war in an urban environment, unfortunately, people who are innocent are going to die. But what is Israel's choice? Israel needs to protect herself. And unlike Hamas, which spends its time surveying where is a music festival where we can go in and rape and murder people, Israel spends its time trying to warn civilians to leave and trying to avoid them. It is so obvious that anyone who sort of spins it the other way is simply denying the truth.
You wrote a powerful piece in the Jewish Journal where you said, there are times when the grief-stricken must recite a Shehechianu, must basically thank God for this moment. Before I quote more of it, that's a blessing for joyous occasions normally.
That's right.
So the discordance of that at this moment, can you explain?
Right, so the article really was about a Shehechianu blessing that was uttered in the Holocaust by the great Rabbi Israel Spira, the Bluzhever Rebbe, who, while lighting a makeshift Hanukkah candle in a barrack in Bergen-Belsen, decided that he was going to make the Shehechianu blessing. And when questioned about
a wooden clog.
Right, he was using a wooden clog as his menorah, and he was using a little bit of shoe polish, which has a lot of wax in it as the fuel, and someone took a little bit off their garment to make a wick, and they smuggled in a match. And they lit this candle for however many seconds it lit. And he made the regular blessings that you make before you light a Hanukkah candle, and the third blessing that you make right at the beginning of Hanukkah is the Shehechianu blessing, which is thanking God for having lived until this moment. And when questioned about it, he said, I also wasn't sure if I should make this blessing, but I looked around the room, and here you have a group of Jews huddled, waiting to light the Hanukkah menorah. And I said, if these people could have this much faith, if these people have this much courage, then I can make a Shehechianu. And that, I think, has been my guiding light during this incredibly dark and incredibly difficult time, that if we look at it, there are so many little points of light. Israel, everyone is volunteering. A friend of mine quoted his son, and he said to me, my son called it in Hebrew a balagan shel chesed, a balagan of kindness. Balagan is not a word that is translatable. It's a Russian word that came over to Hebrew, but it just means a chaos. Everybody's running in different directions to do whatever they can. This place is packing up 25,000 sandwiches, and this one is buying backpacks, and these people are giving blood, and these people are going to the hospital.
And you talked about a restaurant that had sent food, but they couldn't eat it because it wasn't kosher, so they koshered their whole restaurant.
Exactly. There you have, in secular Tel Aviv, where there were battles just 2 weeks ago, in secular Tel Aviv, but battles between the secular and the religious, a non-kosher restaurant says, we want to feed all the soldiers. We'll turn kosher to do that.
Yeah, so powerful. You said good people simply have a failure of imagination, and they often refuse to understand the mindset of those who are evil. You know, that word evil, it is biblical. It's not a contemporary idea so often. October 7th brought it sickeningly home. But just grasping with that existing to the extent we saw it with the numbers that have now been revealed, how many were able to do these unspeakable things?
Well, I think the problem is we've strayed from moral language, and we've sort of deployed psychological language. Psychological language is based on the assumption that you can change and help human beings, and actually this sort of lack of imagination, it comes into strategic thinking. Israel has been working on bringing Hamas over. They had years of détente with Hamas.
Right. There were work permits.
Work permits, and they were loosening things up, and there was all sorts of talk about maybe Hamas will understand. And then a Hamas representative, right after the attack, gave an interview and said, you see, we fooled the Israelis.
Right.
We told them that we wanted to make better lives for our people.
And build a nation.
And instead, we were only getting ready to attack them. And that's evil. Unfortunately, that's evil. It's people who not only want to murder people on the other side, but don't care at all about the lives of their own people, use them as human shields, use them as propaganda points, and by the way, kill out anyone who opposes them. So this is the face of evil. These are people who say, what I'm doing is my ultimate goal in life. How do I destroy something? How do I bring more death to the Israeli public?
The first thing you said we need to do is support. I want to be clear, support who? Who are you talking about? Who should we be supporting, first and foremost? It may be obvious, but I want to make sure it's not just each other, it's our fellow Jews, wherever they are.
Exactly.
And mainly the ones who have been traumatized and the ones who are about to put their bodies in harm's way to save Israel.
I'll be very honest. Our first gut connection has to be with the people in Israel. You have to think about your family. You know, the old line about you're supposed to love the world. Absolutely. But if you go to your spouse, I go to my spouse, and I say, I love you, and I love the entire world, then I don't love my spouse. We have to love our own people first. And this is a horrific attack, and it's an attack on me. An attack on Israel is an attack on every Jew. And the people on college campuses, I mean, that's what people are telling me. I can't believe my professor is siding with the people who murdered my brothers and sisters. I can't believe it. We as Jews don't see ourselves as a nation. We see ourselves as a big family. And for us, it's our brothers and sisters in Israel that we're worried about.
In terms of our Jewish soul and what we have been raised to believe and stand for, when you feel this angry and this vulnerable and this startled by the callousness of our allies, even some of our friends, finding the reservoir of empathy right now, it's harder. It's not impossible, but I am saying it is, I feel more like we are being tested in terms of our kind of Jewish compass now, as Gaza is about to experience what it is about to experience.
No, I agree, but I don't think it's about empathy. It's about our own dignity. It's about our own values.
What do you mean?
About, will we as Jews follow Jewish values and not, so to speak, be turned into something that's unrecognizable? So there was a plot after the war to poison the wells in one German city, and they mentioned it to Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion said, interesting idea. He says, if it brings back any of the 6 million, you should do it. It's not going to bring back any of the 6 million. And we're not that people.
We're not that people. So while we're defending Israel, we hold on to a sense of how.
Exactly. That while we're defending Israel, we are going to stand for the values that Israel was founded on. And those values are, I mean, just to make it clear, the Israeli army has a code of ethics. And if you compare it with the American army, it's a rather powerful code of ethics. Compare how the Israeli army has dealt with their conflicts and how the Americans have dealt with the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the Israeli army has that code of ethics, and one has to be proud of that, because that is what a Jewish state should be doing.
It's amazing to me how little understood that code of ethics is in the world.
Well, it's been buried under propaganda. What happens very often is that whatever misdeeds Hamas does is ignored, and any mistakes Israel makes are blown into full-scale crimes. And that doesn't allow a level playing field for people to assess what's actually happening.
I'm going to ask you an unfair question, which is just about faith right now. It's hard to see God stand by. And obviously this has happened before in our history. But how do you help your proverbial congregant, me, with that, with where God is now?
Sometimes faith doesn't make sense. I always like to point out, we make a blessing right before everyone goes into a funeral. We make a blessing of, we bring the mourners together, and we say the blessing, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam dayan ha'emet, blessed art you, God, who is the true judge. And who feels that way? I mean, if it's a tragic funeral, no one feels that way. And what I tell people is that actually the point of this blessing is not because it makes sense, it's because it doesn't make sense. The Jews are incredibly stubborn. We hold on to our faith even when it seems irrational. And this is one of those moments. And going back to Rabbi Spira, the Blusheva Rebbe, and there's actually a wonderful book which quotes many of his stories that was written by a professor at Brooklyn College by the name of Yafa Eliach. She wrote a book called Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust that includes many of these stories. And the Blusheva Rebbe said that the biggest miracle of miracles is that Jews still had faith after the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. That it's unimaginable, after everything we went through, that we could still have faith, and yet we have faith. So, how could God allow this? Any answer to that insults the memory of those who were murdered. Mm. How do we have faith? Well, because we're really, really stubborn. Now, there's a second element to that teaching, which is, yes, we have faith. And I know that a lot of people are praying, and a lot of people are, and we have a special prayer circle in the morning, we have special prayer circles in the evening. But ultimately, prayer is not the end, it's the beginning. Prayer is meant to lead to action. There's a beautiful verse when the Jews are just outside of the Red Sea, and they're crying, and Moses is praying. And God turns to Moses and says, Ma titzak elai, why are you praying to me? Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yisau, tell the Jews to keep moving. There are times when prayer is appropriate, but prayer is never the end. You need to keep moving. And I think that prayer for us should lead us to action. And people who are worried about the situation, they should donate, and if they've donated again, they should donate more. They should find a way to reach out to their elected representatives. If they have friends in Israel, you should call them. If there's a drive to bring supplies like we're having now at our synagogue and our school, then bring the supplies. What we need to do is act. Prayer is a nice beginning point, but action is much more important.
Keep moving.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi Chaim Steinmetz, for being with us today in the middle of everything you're carrying. I'm grateful for it. And thank you all for being with us. I'm Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.